But I was very, very intrigued by how he would tell the story of imperial travel and occupation. So I thought, why not give him a narrative voice? Why not let him tell the story? And what then happens is that you actually turn things upside down. Of course you do. It's, I think it's a very intriguing way of trying to come to terms with multi-dimensional realities, is turning things upside down. Actually, there's an Indian trope in the Sufi poetry of the Middle Ages, which is called Ulat Bamzi, which means literally upside down, in which the Sufi philosophers thought that actually to provoke a new way of thinking and a new way of looking at things, you have to turn them upside down. And the intriguing thing is that I started off wanting to write a novel about Richard Burton as someone who not only traveled the world, but who actually wanted to culturally adapt himself to different regions and traditions, as someone who actually wanted to undergo a metamorphosis, as someone who was a kind of chameleon, as someone who thought that cultural identity is very, very dynamic and flexible. But the more I wrote from the perspective of Sidi Mubarak Bombay, the more I started developing a very critical and at times even disappointed or even hateful perspective on my main hero, because I saw the other side of all he did, all he thought. And the way I read another thing, I was very intrigued by what Anthony said about the surplus of information. I think the problem is that sometimes the responsibility of the author is to find new information, but very often, particularly if you're dealing with the 19th century and the 20th century, you have too much information. And one of the ways that those in power actually suffocate what we might call truth is by burying it under a huge, huge, huge load of unimportant information, so that it's very difficult to distinguish the necessary from the unnecessary. And it's very true about Richard Burton. You have 10 biographies, and those 10 biographies don't agree on anything substantial. I mean, if you take his marriage, it's a very weird marriage, because he went on their honeymoon on his own, which was in Equatorial Guinea. So just imagine you just got married and your husband says, "Well, darling, I'm going off to Equatorial Guinea. I'll be back in 18 months." People usually in those days did not return from Equatorial Guinea. But anyway, one of the biographies says this was a marriage made in heaven, and the other one says, never were two people less suited for each other. So to answer your question, Anthony, this is really a case of both authors writing the true story of the marriage. So when you have such a surplus of information, I think it's actually very, very useful to get rid of it and to kind of internalize it to a point where you start forgetting it. And I think that is what good novelists do. They try to find out as much as they can, but then they forget that. They forget it on a superficial level. It's somewhere deep down within them. So they have the freedom to reimagine and thus actually come closer to the complexity of reality, which I think really good novels do. And I think I've talked for long enough. Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you. It seems that our panellists have, in fact, tried to answer the question. So you can all pass. The writer owns the past. No one owns the past. Those in power own the past. Well, that is a spectrum, all of them with good points and all of them with significant substance of research behind them. And all of them very well, if I may pass a judgment, very well written books. So the question that does seem to still be there, I thought we might evade it, but we haven't been able to evade it. Who owns the past? And I happen to be the only historian on this platform. And I perhaps may be allowed to point out to the organisers the only female person. So I do feel a certain loyalty to my own profession about trying to get things right, but I do actually have the last say. That was naughty, wasn't it? And I am supposed to ask the first question. So while you're organising your questions, here's mine. It's one that I'm asked sometimes, and I'll ask it of each of the speakers in their turn. Why did you choose that particular subject?
Why did I chose Napoleon? It was a bit of an accident in a way. It starts, it's a fairly long story, but I collect old encyclopedias. So I collected an Encyclopedia Chambers from 1897. Fantastic. You really see the prejudices of the time. You think it's an encyclopedia is full of fact, it's full of prejudice, full of opinion. And I was doing a terrible thing. I was cutting out illustrations from this old encyclopedia, using them in what I called picture stories, creating works of art out of them. And I came across an entry on Napoleon, and it said Napoleon had been to Egypt. And I thought, that's funny. I'd read a bit about Napoleon. I didn't know he'd been to Egypt. And I thought, why did he go to Egypt? He went to Egypt when he was only 28. And he'd just been married. He hadn't been married long. And he just wanted to see the world. And he decided he'd take 167 savants with him to keep him company, to write his story. And I'm tempted by Ilya's notion that the state is the one who owns the past, because Napoleon did exactly that. He wanted these people to write about him, the poets to praise him, the musicians to write great operas about him. He really was desperate to control the representation of what happened in that time in Egypt. He was the world's first spin doctor. He wrote marvellous letters back to the Directory in Paris saying how he'd won this battle, and he did win battles initially, but then all the battles went wrong. But due to the power of words, when he came back to Paris, he was treated as a hero, the hero of Egypt. But I wrote a short story out of that confrontation with Napoleon in the Encyclopedia, and I didn't intend to do any more about it, but 3 publishers came to me and said, if you write a novel, I'll publish that novel. And I just published The Layers of the City, which is a philosophical novel. All my novels are philosophical. Nothing much happens. Someone said to me, actually, in your books, nothing much happens, then nothing much happens again. Which is interesting because I'm into repetition. I love repetition, and so that was sort of a nice little moment. So everyone told me that The Layers of the City was too dense, too philosophical, and a senior Australian writer took me aside and said, you're doing it all wrong. Novels are something that send people to sleep. They just have to be marginally interesting so people stay awake for 15 minutes and then they fall asleep. Your novels are keeping people awake. No one's going to buy them. You're going to be a failure as a novelist. So I took this to heart and I thought, well, gee, if 3 publishers want a novel on Napoleon, I can write a novel on Napoleon, which I've done. So it was in response to the desire of the other, and it was a thoroughly intriguing thing to do. But I never want to write a novel based on a source material ever again. I may, but I never want to. I want to write contemporary novels. I've been writing one since 2003, and that's the next place I'm going to go to.
It's a question I get very often, and it's a horrible cliche, but because it was there. No one had done a book on Blackburn before. If anyone had, I wouldn't have done it. Someone had started one, but as soon as I started mine, he gave up the ghost, and because he was living in Perth and had limited access to the soldiers that were surviving from the Second World War. And we did a deal, and he posted over his material, and I paid him a couple of $100, and I was away. Never. We got a nice head start, so that was was pretty good. But I actually addressed the question in my preface, and if you indulge me, I'll read it to you, because it has been edited by the excellent Michael Boland from Wakefield Press. Inevitably, the question comes, why write a book about a long-dead soldier? There are two preferred responses. Launch into the long, standard spiel detailing Arthur Blackburn's many achievements. The alternative is to say, because no one's done it before. As I progressed on my long journey, I favoured the latter, partly because it was easier, but also because it was true. I remain astounded that this is the first biography of one of Australia's greatest soldiers. So, for those of you who don't know the story, the potted story is he was one of the first ashore at Gallipoli. He was a very unsoldierly looking chap. He had flappy ears, and he was a skinny little solicitor who was quite frail when he was a child, told to give up lacrosse because he was too frail. This chap then was one of the first ashore at Gallipoli, the first 50 or so soldiers ashore at Gallipoli, and made it further inland with a comrade than anyone else did on that first day. And then, one reviewer said that warranted a book on its own, but he went on to win his VC at Pozières in a truly remarkable VC stunt, as they say. Managed to survive the war, helped found the RSL in South Australia, helped found Legacy in South Australia, 3 years in state parliament, about 15 years as state coroner, and then the silly old fool re-enlisted for the Second World War at age 48, I think. He was a battalion commander. He formally captured Damascus from the Vichy French, and was promptly told off by a snooty English colonel, because this wild colonial was roaming the streets waving his slouch hat saying, "I was first, I was first." The English gentleman was about to tell him off until his eye fell on his 1914-18 ribbons, and he noticed that he had a Victoria Cross. So the protocol in the British Australian Army is that any soldier of any rank, be it Field Marshal down to private, must salute a VC winner. So Blackburn was, in that sense, senior to him. Then, of course, he was brought back to fight the Japanese, was captured in Java, promoted to brigadier, and then spent 3.5 years getting beaten up, starved, tortured, etc. So I just thought it was a good story.
Yeah, I think that's a very good answer, because no one has done it before. I think that's probably the reason why we write books. In my case, I wrote a novel about the 19th century because the 19th century isn't over yet. So I thought it might be a good way to write a contemporary novel. So the reason is very simple. The reason is the way Europe, or the so-called West, talks about other regions and continents has been shaped by the 19th century. The language it uses, the conceptions, the terminology, it all comes from the 19th century. So it's all based in an imperial project. And intriguing is, while I was researching for my novel, and that took a long time, about 7 years, one of the things I did is I looked at the Afghanistan campaign of the British Army in 1839, 1840, which, as you might know, was the biggest defeat in the history of the British Army. The Afghanis absolutely destroyed them, and they had to actually flee the country, leave the country, which I think is one of the reasons why they still like going there. They're still trying to kind of get revenge for the beating that, British are bad losers, so they try to get revenge for the beating they got then. The amazing thing, in all seriousness, the amazing thing is that when you read reports by British generals 1840 on Afghanistan, you could actually publish these reports today and just change the names. It was the same language, the same perspective, the same way of looking at the Afghanis, the same way of analyzing the problems, and the same solutions. So actually, the way the West is treating Afghanistan has not changed in the last 170 years. Now, that's not too good if you believe in human progress. It's actually both daunting and terrifying, if you ask me. And this holds true for many, many other places. I mean, whenever a European writes about Africa, he goes on and on, rambles on about tribalism being, the main engine of divisiveness in Africa and so on. But many of the tribes were invented by the colonialists. Tribe in itself is kind of a simplification of a far more complex and far more dynamic form of ethnic identity. So I thought it would be hugely interesting to look at the 19th century and to find out why we have still not overcome it. And the second thing is, whenever I read a novel by a European author on, let's say, India or Africa, I noticed that the locals were minor figures. It was like in the old Hollywood movies. If you were black, the only role they gave you was a servant. So took like 50 years for Afro-American to get something substantial and a substantial role in American movies. So I thought it would be actually really interesting to give Africans, Indians, Arabs a voice and to put them on the same level. So actually to have them as human beings with the same authority and the same with a narrative voice. And therefore, those two things kind of motivated me to write the novel.
Thank you. Well, now, this is a very grand, large crowd. I agree. And I'd like to invite you to ask questions of our writers about themselves or within reason, and their work, even what they're going to do next, which is my other question, but I'll hang on to that one. So, do we have any comments, questions?
Jill, perhaps I could ask a question first.
Yeah.
Jill won the Premier's NonFiction Prize yesterday, so for NonFiction, I think we should give her a round of applause. While we have Jill here, I think we should use her, don't you agree? My question to Jill is there such a thing as a true history?
When I set out to write the biography of Miles Franklin, I had no intention of it turning into a life's work. But the sources are very great, and I was doing it because I violently disagreed with the only other people that had attempted it, because they hadn't read the papers. So I did it because it was there, and also I wanted to get it right. And maybe it's wrong to say right, but I did aim, and I wonder if this is an approved of aim these days, I did aim to write an authoritative work. Can I have that word? I don't expect it to be the last, but I hope that anyone in future will simply have to pay attention to what I've done, that it is part of an ongoing discussion between the present and the past, which somewhere in there truth does lie, but it's an ongoing thing. But I wouldn't dream of giving something the title, The True History of. I think that's an insult to readers, actually. They can work out whether they think it's true or not, or valid. So that's my answer, at least for an interim. As well, you must come to the microphone, and someone is there already, is that right? Go on then, off you go.
Thank you. I was intrigued what Ilya was saying about the sort of Western imperialistic sort of spin we seem to have on the histories and the things that we read. I was in Gallipoli a couple of years ago, and it seems that as Australians we've been fed all this stuff about our history that does kind of make something of Gallipoli that I think it probably wasn't, and it's intriguing to hear what the Turkish people have to say about what Gallipoli was about. I was wondering how it might be that we can redress some of this and actually start to hear the histories more from not just one perspective. I mean, is that possible for authors to actually... I mean, obviously people are starting to have a go at this, but to actually write history in a way that actually may take multiple perspectives. Is that possible?
I think, Ilya, that's your question.
I think it is. I think we're living in very interesting times in that we've had the last 50 years have completely revolutionized the form of history writing. I mean, we had the French school, which started looking at the everyday life of la vie quotidienne of people. For the first time, we had the subaltern studies, which, for example, wrote a completely new history of India. So it's a process in the making. I think we have very interesting books in the last few years about the history of slavery from the perspective of the slaves, as far as one can research that or reimagine that. And of course, we have a growing number of very good historians in countries which were formerly colonialized, which are now looking with a fresh eye on things. So I think, yes, I think in years to come, in decades to come, we have a growing number of authors who are actually multicultural and multilingual. I mean, of course, you always write in one language, but the eco space in their head is multilingual, which I think allows you to depict the complexity of issues much better than when you just have one language and one perspective. So I think, yes, I think we're in a good way.
Would either of yes?
Yeah, I think oral histories are quite interesting. Wendy Lowenstein's Weevils in the Flower, talking to people who went through the Depression. So those sorts of accounts, first-person accounts, are very interesting. There's a great history series called The Private Life History, published in France, that tries to look at what the domestic, intimate circumstances of people were like in the 18th, 17th, 19th centuries, etc. What do they do for bathing? What do they do for letter writing? That sort of stuff. So I love that sort of intimate type of history. And another thing, back to oral history, but Studs Terkel, who interviewed people about their attitudes to work, interviewed people about the Second World War. And that was a great way of collecting different voices. So you have snippets. It's not just the one voice, it's multiple voices. So the more of that sort of recording of what ordinary people think, the better in terms of creating different types of history. There certainly is a need for different types of history because the governments can try and control, quite naturally want to control the amount of information, the type of information. So in Australia, very big issue about nation building, how we conceive of ourselves, how we see ourselves and what our history has been. So that's what governments always have been doing. They're always trying to control the presentation, representation of a country and of the individuals within.
Thank you. And a little comment, I think, as well from South Australia.
Jill's asked me to mention, it might be a little bit off topic, my experience with uncovering a treasure trove of photos from Gallipoli. Blackburn had an old battered trunk that was kept, went to his granddaughter, and we were going through it. It was an absolute treasure trove. Letters, photos, handbooks, right, 303 Lee Enfield handbooks circa 1914, all this wonderful stuff, which I think most of it's gone off to the war memorial now. But we found these old rolls of film and held them up to the light, and we weren't sure what they were. No one had looked at them for years, and I said, that looks a bit like Anzac Cove. And Helen said, well, I'm not sure whether it is or not, and there's a few beach, honeymoon photos on that roll and all the rest of it. We went through and it turned out these were approximately 60 photos of Gallipoli taken by one of the men that landed first on the beach, completely against King's regulations. He would have been in a lot of trouble if if these were found. But so valuable were they that my employer, the Australian, flew me over to Canberra to show the photos to two of the leading historians, one from the War Memorial and also Dr. Peter Stanley. And they were very enthused about the whole thing. They actually opened up some whole new interpretations to places such as Quinn's Post, which Peter Stanley wrote a whole book on this one post. and several other important places on the Gallipoli battlefield landscape. But I suppose the question of interpretation was that both these leading historians differed on a few things, so it was hard for me to be definitive about this photo was this place. So hopefully that adds something to the debate.
Certainly does. It's quite remarkable in your book, I think. Next.
We might have an imperialist past, but most of the West have developed into liberal democracies. And a liberal democracy is a place where no matter how much those in power would like to own the past, they don't. You always get, and I wish to mention this name in particular, you get somebody like Henry Reynolds who will come along and write about the indigenous past here. And he'll say, it wasn't like that. It wasn't like you imagined. It was like this. And he will have a voice. And the biggest group of people, and I wish to make a plug for historians here as well, and I must say that's an appalling innovation that somebody suggested everyone here can write history, because Jill and I won't have a job if that's the case. A terrible thought, and it must be stamped out. But my question really is that I'd like the panel to think about this, that the group of people who've exposed various wrongs in the past that created by Western imperialism are historians living in the West, because the records aren't closed to us. The records that are there we can trawl through, and we can write what we like, providing we can get it published by reputable publishers. And this is, I think, one of the great achievements of the West. We live in free societies, we can write the history we choose, and we are the people, in fact, who've blown the lid on various things. I've tried to blow it on Gallipoli, but that's hopeless. But we've tried to blow it on various things like slavery, like imperialism in Africa, like the futility of being involved in Afghanistan. So I wish to defend the West, and I'd like to hear what the panel have to say about that.
I think reality is more complex than that. First of all, the archives, even in the West, even in a liberal democracy, the archives are not opened. Anyone who actually looks at periods of contemporary history that are slightly, let's say, complicated because they involve maybe misuse of power, will find that many of the archives are still not opened. Example from Germany, if you are a historian dealing with the Red Army faction, which was a terrorist organization in Germany in the 70s, you do not have access, for example, to all the material, let's say, by the Secret Service. Same thing with people who look at, let's say, the Vietnam War. There's still many, many things in the British archives that are top secret. Basically, the state claims that something is top secret when the content is not going to be favorable to them. It's also done in Western liberal democracies. So I think you have different forms of state control, and of course, as you said, soft power. Of course, there are enormous differences, but it would be a mistake to assume that even in a liberal democracy you have free access to everything. And the second thing is that even in a liberal democracy, for example, if you take Europe, it is only because authors were hugely critical and tried to write an alternative history that we have actually now developed a complex understanding, let's say, of Nazism or of Stalinism, because it was after the Second World War in Germany, for many decades, the new liberal democracy was actually not that interested in a very critical analysis of what happened in the years after 45, because many of the people who were prominent in the Third Reich then went on to be successful members of the new liberal democracy. So it is always the critical authors who actually force, even in a liberal democracy, who force the state to kind of soften up, and therefore I think that their role is vital in any form of society.
The only reason I mentioned the West, it certainly wasn't a political comment, it was just to illustrate that I didn't find the question terribly important, the overarching question terribly important to me. I think I need to fight on the ground of people abusing our military past to promote jingoism. I think there's not enough people that are doing that. I think I'm heavily outnumbered, but I'm going to keep the fight going. So that was it was just a way of illustrating that I didn't find the question that important to me.
Thank you.
I really would like to hear your view of Tolstoy as a historian when he wrote War and Peace.
Yeah, absolutely. That was less than 5 minutes, wasn't it? Yeah. No, actually, all the I mean, realism, I think, 19th century realism in writing novels is very much defined by the concept that the author needs to become a historian, as opposed to the 18th century where you had people like Swift or many others who had, let's say, a more imaginative and were closer to the free flight of fantasy. The 19th century, whether it's Balzac or Tolstoy or very much Stendhal. I think Stendhal even has explicitly stated that it was his aim to develop the novel actually as a higher form, both of history writing as well as of sociology and other sciences. So. I mean that's the greatness of these novels, that they encompass that as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. We've covered a lot of ground, and I thank our panellists. I remind you of the books, which is why we're all here. That is to say, Napoleon's Double, Collector of Worlds, and Arthur Blackburn, VC. And if you'd be so kind, you might take Miles Franklin in too.